I've lost like 10 to 15 pounds of pure fat over the past 4 months, and I've learned a ton in the process. So I'm not on a zero carb, I'm not on a ketogenic diet. I kept my carbs up so that I could continue to feel energized in the gym. Intermittent fasting works, but there's no benefit of intermittent fasting over, a more calorie-centric approach.
Max, what would you say are the top foods people want to make sure they're avoiding when it comes to optimizing brain health and cognitive function? I know this is a topic you love to delve into, and you're up on the research, you have a personal connection to it, which we'll get into later. But let's start out with the foods we want to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest dietary villains, if you want to call it that, of the standard American food environment is the proliferation of ultra-processed foods. And I guess we could take this in a number of different directions because I feel like this is starting to become more and more known. But, today adults consume 60% of their calories from shelf-stable, packaged, processed foods, which are the darling, high-margin, high-ticket items of the food industry. They're cheap to produce, and they return big profits. And, you wonder why they're so heavily marketed, why you see ads on TV for these kinds of foods. Well, because, people are buying them and the food industry wants to create repeat customers. But unfortunately, we see that higher adherence to the standard American diet, which again is typified by the consumption of these types of foods, is associated with increased risk for early mortality, increased risk for cancer, and obviously increased risk for obesity and diabetes. We're seeing that plainly. You can step off any plane at any airport and see the startling obesity statistics up close and personal, but then also dementia. So recent research has actually associated increased ultra-processed food consumption with a starkly increased risk for the development of dementia. We see for every 10% increment in ultra-processed food consumption, people's risk of dementia increases by 25%, which is essentially a dose response, which strengthens the possibility that this is actually a causal link. Because correlational studies, whenever we say risk, that's inherently a correlational assertion. It's not necessarily causal, but ultra-processed foods, they're minimally satiating. By the time you've eaten ultra-processed foods to satiety, unfortunately, you've already overconsumed them, according to research from Kevin Hall's group, funded by the NIH. So they're very obesogenic in the sense that they drive you to overconsume them. They're incredibly calorie dense. They're nutrient poor. So that's why if you look typically at the ingredients list of any ultra-processed bread product or wheat-based snack of any sort, you'll see they've usually been enriched with vitamins and minerals, and that's just testament to the fact that the food supply has become essentially devoid of nutrient density. And so, we're living in a time where, for the first time in human history, there are more overweight people walking the earth than there are underweight, and these ultra-processed foods are, I think, foundational to that phenomena that we're now seeing. And children consume even more of them. We see that children, their diets are comprised upwards of 70% ultra-processed foods. So it's a major problem. Now, when you break apart ultra-processed foods, there's a continuum of food processing. So it's not that processing is inherently evil or dangerous or toxic or anything like that. You can buy unprocessed foods around the perimeter of your supermarket, but then the minute you start to prepare them for dinner, you are processing them to some degree, right? Like when you take an apple out of your crisper drawer and you slice it, you're processing it to some degree. You puree it into an apple sauce, you're processing it even further. And then you take the juice, you make apple juice, you're processing it even further. You take the juice and you create a fruit snack that's shelf stable, and you've suddenly got an ultra processed food on your hands. And the good news is that ultra-processed foods, part of what defines them is that they can't be made in your typical home kitchen. So that's why I implore people to spend more time cooking at home. It's a great way to reduce risk for obesity. It's a great way to reduce ingestion of mysterious fat calories that seemingly soak almost any item that you order in the restaurant setting. And it's a great way to encourage healthy habits, like with, if you've got children or the like. Kids love cooking together, and it encourages them to model, to replicate the behavior that they see modeled by you. And it also encourages them to eat more whole, minimally processed foods. So So I think eating at home more. But again, like ultra processed foods, there's nothing like what it really comes down to is the fact that these foods, they tend to be highly calorie dense, nutrient poor. The rate at which we are able to consume them is faster than whole foods. So there's actually their obesogenic nature is related in some way to the fact that we can eat them really quickly. We eat them more quickly than we can whole foods that need to be chewed, And so this is part of the reason why this is a problem is because it actually takes our stomachs time to register that they have food in them before they turn off hunger hormones like ghrelin. So ultra-processed foods, we consume them super rapidly. That's part of the problem. They typically have added sugar, which is essentially just empty calories, unhealthy additives that might play a role in disrupting gut microbiota. And then finally, with regard to brain health, this whole, there's a huge debate now raging online seemingly about where ultra-processed seed oils, vegetable oils, and the like fit into an optimized diet. And the impact that chronic consumption of ultra-processed grain and seed oils like canola oil, corn oil, and soy oil, which you'll typically find in these ultra-processed foods, the role that they play in long-term brain health is a huge question mark. So you have a lot of voices online now, particularly voices coming from the so-called evidence-based community, claiming that these oils are universally safe, but we have no idea the long-term impact that they play in brain health. And if anybody is doubting this, my assertion, there was a great review published in 2021 by Taha, Taha, 2021. You can Google it. It was in a journal published under Nature, but it wasn't Nature. I forget the actual. It might have been Science of Food or Food Science. Basically, exposing all of the questions that still remain with regard to these fats, primarily linoleic acid, which comprise these grain and seed oils, how they impact our long-term brain health. So. Precautionary principle dictates that you're probably better off minimizing your consumption of these novel oils in your diet. And again, they're part of this sort of unholy trinity that make up what we typically would define as an ultra processed food.
We've been making slow and steady progress getting more people to subscribe to the channel. Right now we're at 11.5% of the people that watch the videos. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second and do so below. It takes a second, it helps the community continue to grow, and helps the show continue to bring on the biggest guests. Thank you ahead of time. Continue to enjoy this episode with Max. You're still a fan of, and we've talked about this before, olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil. So plant oils, but I want to make sure we differentiate between the grain and seeds and these other healthy oils.
Yeah, so the oils that you've listed off are primarily fruit oils. So avocado and olives and even coconut, they're fruits. So fruit oils seem to be actually quite benevolent. And the primary oil that I recommend people actually embrace is extra virgin olive oil, which there's tons of data on this, on extra virgin olive oil as it pertains to cardiometabolic biomarkers, to brain health. We can see, in the hierarchy of evidence, we can see observational research. People who regularly ingest extra virgin olive oil seem to be protected against a whole host of chronic non-communicable conditions, whether we're talking about cardiovascular disease or neurologic conditions like Alzheimer's disease. We can see, randomized controlled trials, the PREDIMED study, which is, not a perfect study in the sense that there are myriad variables that were altered in the different intervention groups, but it was by and large a diet that embraced fat, and the primary fat was extra virgin olive oil. Up to 1 liter a week was consumed in that study. And then animal research and in vitro research, we see across the board that, and meta-analyses further validate that extra virgin olive oil has a number of benevolent effects to our physiology. It's anti-inflammatory. It's primarily comprised of heart-healthy monounsaturated fat, which is chemically stable. So that's the primary oil that I would recommend, using for almost everything in your kitchen. I mean, you can use it as a sauce. You can cook with it at low to medium temperatures. It's a big myth that you can't cook with it. So it's a great fat. I will, remind people that any fat and particularly, oils, which are very easy to pour on, they're highly calorie dense. So I'm not saying to drown your food in extra virgin olive oil, but it's when it comes to picking which oil to use and to prioritize in your diet, it's pretty much cut and dry at this point that extra virgin olive oil. The evidence is too overwhelmingly positive.
All right, well, it's pretty clear that when it comes to something like a salad, you would advocate for olive oil, and you mentioned using it for cooking as well. But how do you feel about cooking with animal fat, things like butter, ghee, tallow, versus, say, an avocado oil or olive oil?
Yeah, that's a great question because, I think the fact that fat was so heavily demonized over the past couple of decades, the pendulum has now swung in the other direction. And I think with regard to some diet tribes, the pendulum has swung a bit too far, where now you see people putting butter on everything and, seemingly slathering all of their food in tallow and the like. And, I think, first of all, everybody's different. So everybody's going to respond to higher levels of saturated fat in the diet differently. But, I don't think it makes a ton of sense to consume saturated fat either, to be honest. And tallow is about 50% monounsaturated fat, which again is incredibly heart healthy. And depending on how the tallow is produced, if it comes from a cow that was primarily grass fed, and of course grass finished, the tallow is going to have a higher proportion of stearic acid, which we know is neutral from a cardiovascular standpoint. So tallow can be great, and it's certainly chemically stable at high heats. But again, everybody's different. So some people might, start integrating a little more tallow into their diet and see an over response in for example, their lipid profile. And I still think that we need to be mindful of we absolutely have to be mindful of cardiovascular health as it pertains to brain health, because the brain is fed blood and nutrients and oxygen by a network of microvessels that are incredibly delicate and vulnerable. And so we need to protect that vasculature. I think like the overconsumption of saturated fat from an evolutionary standpoint doesn't make a ton of sense. And butter we see is molecularly unique in the sense that it lacks something called milk fat globule membrane, which means that we actually might see an exaggerated lipid response when we consume butter. And what I mean by that is we might see a bump in biomarkers like LDL cholesterol. Now, I'm not, of the opinion that our LDL needs to be like on the floor to like infant level, like some in the vegan dietary tribe will claim. But I think again, everybody's different, and some people are hyper responders to saturated fat. Some people are hyper responders to dietary cholesterol. And so I think by and large, like the fat where there's the most evidence and a fat and a fat that has the most potential to do the most good for the most people, it would be, in my view, a fat that's primarily monounsaturated. So like, again, extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, and the like. Avocado oil is great, but there's some evidence that suggests that a lot of them are counterfeit now, just because of the rapid proliferation of avocado oil, which 10 years ago, nobody was using. Avocado oil wasn't a thing. So, there is this concern that many of them are counterfeit. So you just want to make sure that you're buying it from a good brand, a reputable brand. And it is great to use to cook at high temperatures, but it doesn't have any of these powerful phytochemicals that extra virgin olive oil has. So you're just not getting, if you are going to be adding an oil to your diet, and oils, again, oil is an incredibly calorie dense food. It's also a pretty nutrient poor food. I mean, it's like there are no micronutrients in any oil, for that matter. You might as well optimize for the oil that has all these important beneficial phytochemicals in it, and so that would be extra virgin olive oil as opposed to avocado oil.
One area when it comes to oil I find really interesting, I've been thinking about lately, is there's these brands coming out with different quote unquote healthy chips. And I don't want to throw any specific brands under the bus, but we know brands like Siete are really exploding, and Terra. And there's plantain chips that are fried just in coconut oil, and Siete, I think they use avocado oil. So we've mentioned those are healthier choices, but how do you feel? It's like those chips get a free pass in the health world. How do you feel about when they're using them for frying?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually, I stumbled across some really authentic Mexican-style tortilla chips made in tallow, and they were delicious. I mean, they're so good. And so eating those kinds of foods in moderation, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. They could be they're pleasurable, they're enjoyable, they taste great. So long as you're able to control your intake, because again, like those foods might not necessarily be ultra processed, like a corn tortilla fried in beef tallow, like that's something that you could easily make in your own home. So I would hesitate to call that an ultra processed food item, but they still can promote overconsumption. So you just want to be, I guess, mindful of that. But I'm a big fan. I mean, I'll consume some of these on occasion. Avocado oil, is like, it's again chemically stable. It's not one of these vegetable oils that is composed primarily of polyunsaturated fat, which makes it prone to oxidation. So I have a little bit more faith that the fats that I'm ingesting, if the product contains primarily avocado oil or tallow, is unadulterated, meaning it's less prone to oxidation. It's going to be less likely to be a damaged fat, and so I feel a little bit more comfortable consuming them. But again, these foods, I mean, for me, and everybody's different, but for me, these foods can be, I can have the tendency to overconsume them. So I just have to be careful with that regard.
And while we're on the topic of ultra processed foods, I think it's important we address this gray area. And you kind of touched on this before, where even when we start to cut up food, we're starting to process it and it's no longer in its unadulterated form. But what about things like a grass-fed, grass-finished whey powder? Or some of these companies that are totally legit. I think some of them sponsor your podcast and sponsor my show. And they're making bars that are filled with good ingredients. But obviously, they've been radically changed from their unadulterated form.
Yeah, no.
So I think for people that are trying to take all this in and decipher what's okay and what's not okay, let's talk about that group in the middle and how you feel about them.
Yeah, no, that's a great point that you bring up, and there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, right? Like, but by and large, it's like the analogy that I would use is like the BMI, which is this highly contested, especially today, controversial screening tool used to determine how obese a population is, right? So a BMI is a very crude, blunt tool that basically utilizes a person's height and weight to arrive at one number that indicates the likelihood that that person is going to be obese or not. And actually, obesity, if you're in a certain range, you're considered obese at the population level, but it's a screening tool. It's not a diagnostic tool. So at the end of the day, whether or not a person is obese it needs to be determined based on other anthropometric factors, like what is this person's waist to hip ratio, for example, or how much visceral fat are they carrying? What is their body fat percentage? How much skeletal muscle are they carrying, right? You can't just go based on a person's height or weight. Otherwise, somebody like The Rock, will send up a red flag as being obese, and he's clearly not obese. He's heavy because he carries a ton of muscle, and so he's in fantastic shape, right? So the term ultra processed is ultimately it's a fantastic screening tool, right? Like we can see the more ingredients a product has, the more likely it is to be ultra processed. If it has ingredients that you can't pronounce in it, the more likely it is to be ultra processed, because the less likely it is that those ingredients are going to be typically found in a standard average kitchen, right? So it's a good screening tool. But that being said, there are foods that are processed that are very healthy. So like extra virgin olive oil is to some degree a processed food. Whey protein is probably even more processed. But by and large, the kinds of ultra processed foods that typify the standard American diet and play a role, I would say, in the obesity crisis and the crisis of related conditions is that they're primarily comprised of a slurry of refined carbohydrates and added fats and added sugars and added sodium and just added. It's essentially like a slurry of calorie density and ultimately energy density. But you take something like whey protein, and whey protein, while it might be processed, it's primarily protein, and protein is actually a very important nutrient. And it's not a nutrient that people in the United States tend to be deficient in, but it is a nutrient that most people would be well served to consume more of, particularly in relation to the RDA for protein, which is about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, which doesn't seem to be optimal for with regard to optimizing body composition and building and maintaining lean mass, particularly as we age. So, whey protein is an example of a processed. I hesitate even to call it ultra processed, in fact, because whey protein we've been making for many decades, if not centuries at this point, as a byproduct of the cheese making process. So, whey is something that has been around for a long time. It was just a byproduct. It was thrown away until we realized what a fantastic source of protein it is, and such a high biological value source of protein. So yeah, there are always going to be exceptions to the rule, and one single food is, not in any way going to one acute exposure to a given food isn't going to affect your health in any significant way either. And so sometimes, ultra processed foods, we want to eat them because we enjoy them, and we should be able to enjoy foods that we're eating and indulge mindfully when we so choose as well. It's like not everything that I watch on TV is going to be some intellectually stimulating, enriching experience, right? Sometimes I just want to watch something mindless. And so you should be able to eat something on occasion that's not necessarily the most nutrient dense food. You're eating it because you enjoy it. You're eating it maybe because your significant other has baked it for you and it doesn't have, all the pristine ingredients that you would otherwise normally prefer in it. But that's where it's important to recognize that your diet doesn't have to be perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect diet, for one. And for two, food is not just fuel. It's not just medicine. It can be medicine, but it's not just medicine. It's a way that, humans use to communicate with one another, to show up for one another, to bond, to express love, to celebrate. It's so many different things. So, but yeah, that was a great point, Jesse. We can't be dogmatic, even when talking about a food category as problematic as ultra-processed foods are.
Let's come back to the protein piece. You started to touch on the fact that this is something that is critically important to make sure we're getting good quality protein in the diet. For somebody tuning in right now saying, I eat some meat and vegetables and I'm on a whole foods diet, let's talk about the difference between getting enough protein and then optimizing it.
Yeah, so protein is, it's crucially important for many reasons. Your body doesn't prioritize storing protein as fat the way that it does fat or even carbohydrates, because your body is essentially made of protein. It's the most satiating macronutrient, meaning satiety is that sensation of being full, right? And we want to get as full as we can be on as few calories as it takes to get there. That really is should be mission critical for anybody trying to sustain a healthy weight, particularly today in the context of the obesogenic food environment, where foods are, the primary foods that we spend our time in proximity to are, as I mentioned earlier, minimally satiating. So satiety is really a key here, and it's starting to gain more traction, thankfully, as a tool that we can use to assuage our hunger. And protein really goes the distance in terms of doing that, because again, it's the most satiating macronutrient beyond carbohydrates and fat. And the science behind this, we can look to what's referred to sometimes as the protein leverage hypothesis. So we tend to leverage calories in our environment to satiate or satisfy our innate need for amino acids. And our bodies, we need protein. Protein is an essential nutrient, and we need a relatively large amount of it every day for good health. If you compare that to fats, the amount of essential fats on a per gram basis that we need in a 24-hour period is actually quite low. We need our essential fats, we need our omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, but beyond that, there's really, obviously we need fat to absorb fat-soluble vitamins and the like, but the only essential fats are the essential fats, the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And then there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. You can get by on a zero carbohydrate diet. Not that that's optimal, but the idea of there being an essential carbohydrate, that's just biologically, that doesn't exist. But protein, on a daily basis, we need to ingest quite a bit of it. And so our bodies will leverage what's around to satisfy that innate drive for amino acids. And so it's thought that our hunger mechanisms, by and large, are pre-programmed to seek out protein in the environment. And so a lot of the time when people are hungry, it's their bodies telling them to get more protein. And we see data that suggests that people who consume more protein, they consume less energy from carbohydrates and fat. We see that higher protein breakfasts lead to lower calorie intakes over the subsequent 24-hour period. So, if you're trying to optimize your body composition, you really want to focus on a savory, protein-rich breakfast. And so that's that'll go a great way towards reducing your overall hunger levels throughout the day and stabilizing your blood sugar and having a number of other important benefits. And when you ingest protein, there's what's called the thermic effect of feeding. So about a third of the calories, a little bit less than that, but roughly a third of the calories that you ingest via protein are actually burnt off via the digestion of that protein. So you get a bit of a caloric-free ride by optimizing for protein in your diet as well. And then there was research published by Stuart Phillips that shows us that high protein foods also tend to be very nutrient dense foods in general. So where you find protein in the food supply, you also find other really important essential nutrients like zinc, vitamin B12, particularly when discussing like animal products, animal source proteins. So yeah, it really is an important macronutrient. And the data suggests, so, again, nobody's walking around today protein deficient. But when it comes to optimizing body composition, there have been a number of papers and meta-analyses published that show us that we essentially should strive for roughly double the RDA on a daily basis. So the RDA, as I mentioned, is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Roughly double that, 1.6 grams per kilogram, seems to be basically the minimal effective dose for optimizing the work that we put in, with regard to our fitness routines. Ideally, everybody listening to this is on some kind of fitness regimen. And so 1.6 grams per kilogram, which equates to about 0.7 to 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, seems to be, a more optimal, threshold to strive for on a 24-hour period. And you can easily achieve that by, if you're eating 3 meals a day, try to get 40 grams of protein in each meal. It's if you're not used to eating a higher protein diet, it could seem like an insurmountable goal, but it's actually pretty easy once you get into the habit of it. Optimizing for things like, lean chicken breast or red meat or eggs. Lately I've been mixing, I'm a huge fan of eggs for brain health. Egg yolks are one of nature's few multivitamins, but you could even mix 2 or 3 whole eggs with a couple of egg whites to just increase the protein calories further. It becomes really easy after a while once you get into the habit of it.
And do you find the average person, you made it sound like we can get enough protein to optimize through diet alone, but do you find a lot of people need something like a whey protein to get beyond what the diet can provide?
Yeah, whey protein is super helpful. You don't need it. You absolutely don't need whey protein, but it just makes it more effortless and convenient to hit those numbers. For people who are busy, for people who are on the go, whey protein is a great tool. It really is. I mean, there are only a handful of supplements of note with regard to helping to optimize body composition. I mean, for all the marketing that you see in the fitness industry, there really only are a handful of supplements that have been shown to have a strong both safety and efficacy record. And whey protein is really one of those supplements that just seems to, it's incredibly effective, and it's not rocket science as to why. I mean, it's just a very high biological value, high quality protein, and it contains a very high concentration of leucine, which is the amino acid that's sort of like rate limiting in the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. And so it's great. But again, you don't need it, but it does seem to play a number of beneficial roles. It seemingly can optimize immune function by providing precursor molecules to glutathione, which is your body's master antioxidant. So that's one of them. And then, there's like creatine, but there's not really many others. But it's like, if you look at anybody online, particularly in the fitness space, I mean, they're consuming copious like whey protein, creatine, and there's not really much else, with regard to like natural supplements that are food based, that are again safe and effective.
Can you think of any others off the top of your head?
I think smart supplementation is really important. There seems to be a role for omega-3 fatty acids, but like pretty high dose. from a body composition standpoint, it seems to require pretty high doses to see an effect. So fish oil I wouldn't recommend taking for body composition. But no, I mean, that's it. Like, some people are really into citrulline malate, which, as a pre-workout can help support nitric oxide production, which can help you get a bit more of a pump and theoretically help support, performance in the gym. I'm a big fan of cocoa flavanols. There's a good amount of research on cocoa flavanols, also as in part because they can help promote nitric oxide production, increasing blood flow and exercise performance and the like. But no, I mean, the low hanging fruit, the real heavy hitters are going to be like a good quality protein supplement, as well as creatine. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything else. I mean, maybe a good electrolyte supplement, but those are more like dependent on, your own personal, like, are you sweating vigorously on a daily basis? What does your diet look like? That might you might need you might be well suited for an electrolyte supplement, but like you may also not. But for women, for men, for people across the age spectrum, yeah, I mean, protein and creatine, they're the two gold standards. Maybe you can like add, if you want to consider it a supplement, caffeine. Caffeine has a well-known ergogenic track record in terms of helping to bolster athletic performance. About, I believe, 100 to, I think meta-analysis showed it's like 100 to 200 milligrams, about an hour pre-workout seems to be really beneficial. But I don't know if I would consider that personally a supplement, because I could just get that from my coffee.
When you're talking about omega-3s there, you mentioned them from a body composition perspective there. But how do you feel about them, coming back to the opening theme of our chat here, brain health? Do you feel like if somebody wants to optimize in that realm, supplementing with omega-3s beyond what they're getting in the diet is optimal?
No, I think that if you're regularly consuming fatty fish, oily fish, then the data doesn't suggest a real necessity for the supplementation of fish oil. With regard specifically to brain health, there is a role for higher dose, about 4 grams a day, fish oil for cardiovascular health, which of course is going to support brain health, for reducing triglycerides. So there's good data on the role of fish oil there's actually an FDA-approved drug on the market called Lugavere, which is a fish oil-based supplement that can help lower triglycerides. And yeah, I mean, I think recently we've seen that fish oil for older adults can help support cognitive function, but it's unclear. If people are regularly eating cold water fatty fish, I would surmise that the role of fish oil is the potential role for fish oil would be diminished if you're regularly consuming fish. But I don't regularly consume. I consume fish, once a week, maybe, which is once or twice a week is what the MIND diet would say is like the protective threshold. The MIND diet is a diet devised at Rush University, shown to reduce risk for cognitive decline and dementia. About 1 to 2 servings of fish a week is what they recommend. But if you're not consuming fish every day, which I think most people in the United States are not, it could be beneficial to supplement with fish oil just as a form of added insurance. Also, we tend not to get omega-3s in the standard American food supply anymore. And many of us are poor at converting the plant-based form of omega-3s, alpha-linolenic acid, to its usable form in the body. So I think for most people, most people who are not regular fish consumers, who are not consuming it on a daily basis, they would be well suited to ingest 1 to 2 grams of fish oil on a daily basis. But also with fish oil, you want to make sure that it's high quality. So this is one of the supplements that, like, when we're talking about whey protein, it really doesn't matter like what brand you go with. Like creatine, as long as it's like micronized and it's you don't want to buy it like off the street. But like, as long as it's a reputable brand, has a decent, rating on Amazon, it doesn't really matter which you pick, or whatever. It doesn't have to be on Amazon. But fish oil is one where, like, I like to spend a little bit more to know that I'm getting a product that is not going to be adulterated, because fish oil fats are highly prone to oxidation, even more so than linoleic acid, which is the primary fat in these grain and seed oils that we've talked about earlier. You want to make sure that you're getting it from a place that stores their own supplements. They don't use like third party shipping and logistics companies, because you don't know how the products are handled. And you also, there are certain things that you want to look for on the label, like IFO certification, the International Fish Oil Standards. It's a third party independent testing organization that measures fish oil purity and quality. So I look for that typically, like on the bottles of the fish oils that I buy. So yeah, you generally want to spend a little bit more for your fish oil, because a lot of them are oxidized and adulterated and low potency in general. So it's not necessarily the amount of fish oil on the indicated by the bottle; it's the amount of the active ingredient are the omega-3 fatty acids, and specifically it's eicosapentaenoic acid, or EPA, and docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA. And you want to make sure you're getting, when I say 1 to 2 grams, you're getting 1 to 2 grams combined of EPA and DHA specifically.
I know you recently interviewed Dr. Gundry. I recently had him on the show too, and we were talking about omega-3s. His current recommendation, I think it's 1,000 milligrams of DHA. And I pushed him on the EPA thing, and he's not concerned about that, but he uses that as his barometer for making sure you're getting the right dose, because yeah, there can be fillers in there, and there's so many different ones out there. Probably a lot of it is marketing these days, where it's like high in EPA, high in DHA, and so many different brands, and it can get really confusing for people.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think EPA, I think both are important. DHA is important particularly because it provides the building blocks to neuronal cell membranes. It's one of the most important structural building blocks of the brain. But EPA primarily is what we see that triglyceride lowering effect in response to. And also EPA provides resolvins, which are known to play a role in resolving the inflammatory cascade in the body. So I think both are important.
Yeah, I don't think he was poo-pooing on the EPA. He was just, I think, considering when you're looking at dosages, that takes care of itself kind of thing if you're focused on the DHA.
Yeah, and also I wouldn't, typically in food, you ingest both, right? Where you maybe, the exception would be egg yolks, but an egg yolk is literally designed by Mother Nature to grow a brain. But elsewhere in the food environment, when you see EPA, you tend to also see DHA in comparable ratios. And so I would not want to ingest one at a dose that's too far out of range with its physiologically appropriate counterpart. And so, yeah, I would want to make sure that I'm getting both. Like when you buy a standard fish oil pill, they're usually like getting the fats from fish, whether it's anchovies or mackerel or herring, and you get both in the ratio that they would appear in those fish. And our brains probably evolved at a time when our hunter-gatherer ancestors were either, on the coasts or had access to brain. And so, they were probably ingesting a lot of these fats, but in their physiologically appropriate ratios.
And considering that you mentioned how quality is so important, specifically with fish oil, do you have specific brands that you use and recommend?
For a long time, I don't have any affiliation with the companies, but Nordic Naturals I've used for a long time. I saw actually Whole Foods brand had IFO certification, if I recall correctly. I could be wrong. But yeah, Nutrigold I think is another brand. There are a number of good brands now on the market. So yeah, shouldn't be too difficult to find. I have no affiliation with any of these brands. But yeah, you just want to make sure that you're going for a good one. Like I wouldn't buy fish oil from like CVS brand, which is a US, I don't know if you have CVS up in Canada, but
not that I know of. I know of it from probably the US, but
yeah, I wouldn't buy like their own in-house brand. I would want to go for like a brand that's like a little bit more reputable in the natural food space.
You've mentioned eggs a couple times. How do you feel about raw egg yolks? Lately, I've been making this drink with protein powder. I put a few raw egg yolks in there, mix like some coconut milk with it, just to get a good quality fat, high protein drink. And again, I know you're a fan of the protein, but I've been on and off with the raw egg yolks over the years. Right now I'm in an on phase, and I'm curious how you feel. And I've heard different things about the egg whites. They need to be cooked, or there's anti-nutrients in there. Do you ever consume raw eggs?
Well, you're right. Egg whites, if you consume them frequently, you can create a biotin deficiency. So you want to make sure that your egg whites are fully cooked. But egg yolks are great, and I would consume them raw. I mean, I don't regularly, but they're full of delicate fats, and so hypothetically exposing them to heat can help. Would probably contribute to the denaturing of those fats and also the cholesterol that they contain. So I don't think that that's a bad idea, providing you're taking all the necessary food safety precautions. But yeah, no, I mean, raw egg yolks are great. I'm a huge fan of eggs. I think a lot of people might be confused when, like, sometimes when eating out, I'll do some whole eggs, and then I'll also mix some egg whites in there as well, because what I'm trying to do is increase the protein, like the proportion of protein calories, without increasing the proportion of fat calories. A lot of people, like I've posted recently that I buy now fat-free Greek yogurt. Well, I get so many comments about this. Like, some people are confused. Like, I thought full-fat dairy is better for us. Like, why are you skipping out on the dairy fat? It's not that I have anything against dairy fat. Dairy fat is healthy. It's just that I'm trying to, like, increase the protein calories in my diet while also maintaining a degree of flexibility so that I can ingest those fat calories elsewhere. Like for dinner, if I want to have like a ribeye, like you only have a certain calorie budget on a 24-hour period, right? Before you start entering that hypercaloric fat storage territory. And so, I'm not like a bodybuilder or anything, but like I think we all should be a little bit more mindful of the fact that like calories aren't the only thing that matter, but they do matter. And so when I talk about prioritizing protein, oftentimes when you ingest protein, whether it's animal source foods, if you're not careful, you could be ingesting a whole lot of fat calories along with those protein calories. If you're a plant-based dieter, protein calories often come with a ton of starch calories. So, people will you have to like take what I'm saying and like understand that I'm saying to increase protein calories, not fat calories and not carbohydrate calories. And, in so doing, you're buying yourself a little bit of added like dietary flexibility to have those starches and carbohydrate calories elsewhere from other foods that you might enjoy, or your fat calories from other foods, that contain fat that you might enjoy. So all that is being said, yeah, I love eggs. Egg yolks, I think, are wonderful. And I'm going to start throwing them into my smoothies at this point. You've convinced me.
Well, it's interesting, Max. You're somebody that maintains such a lean composition that I find it really fascinating, the fact that you do talk about this calorie piece and being mindful of it. I know you just turned 41. You took a picture on Instagram with your shirt off. You're looking pretty ripped. So have you ever found that when you haven't been cautious and you've included, say, the whole egg and have been less mindful of calories, have you noticed your body composition change? Is that why you're so careful?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've lost like 10 to 15 pounds of pure fat over the past 4 months, and I've learned a ton in the process. And it is fascinating. Like, here's the deal. Food quality is, I think, the primary variable. It's super, super important. What you eat determines, by and large, how much you eat. And most people are completely naive to that concept, right? We've seen, and I've already mentioned this, that people who consume ultra-processed foods as the bulk of their diet, by the time you've eaten them to satiety, you've already overconsumed them. Conversely, by focusing on minimally processed foods, like whole foods, you reach a point of satiety where you're either at energy balance or even slightly below, which is what that Kevin Hall study showed, that people who, consumed primarily in this crossover study, minimally processed foods, they came in effortlessly at a calorie deficit. And yet they were just as satiated as the ultra-processed food, intervention. And so you can and should be able to maintain a perfectly healthy body composition, a lean body composition, by focusing primarily on food quality. Now, that is today, to be clear, a form of restriction, right? So like that is a form of restriction in and of itself. You have to restrict yourself to some degree of these ultra-processed foods, which are seemingly everywhere. 73% of the food items at your local supermarket now machine learning has showed us in a study recently published are ultra processed. So, I mean, by and large, the food supply is like foods designed to make you overconsume them. But to get like even leaner than that, if you so choose to, which is not necessarily going to be a health decision, but instead, maybe an aesthetic decision, or or maybe just a personal challenge that you want to set for yourself, you do have to become a little bit more discerning and diligent about where your calories are coming from. And so, another form of restriction, if you want to call it that, is, I, a couple of months ago, started eating home a lot more often. And, it's not that I'm like some big extravagant, like I go to, fancy restaurants all the time. No, I just eat out. Like I go to, a lot of fast casual restaurants. I'll get like a salad here and there from like one of these salad chains. And the amount of phantom fat calories that you ingest when eating out regularly is just like, is massive. It's massive. It's like a completely underappreciated source of empty calories. The same way that, drinking soda, a soft drink, adds a ton of empty calories in the form of sugar to your body, which nobody essentially needs. I mean, eating out generally is going to provide phantom calories in the form of fat. And so by eating home, I saw, more frequently, I saw, a significant portion of like my body fat just like melt off. But then, I wanted to get a little bit more diligent just to try for my own edification, just my own challenge to myself. Because I'm not an athlete. I'm not a bodybuilder. I don't, I'm not one of these like biohacker guys that like makes a living showing myself shirtless on social media. That is not who I am, right? But I wanted to see like, were I to, want to get to a more quote unquote shredded state, like what would it take? And so, I started to realize that like, fat calories add up really quickly, and you do need fat. Fat is crucially important for digestion. You want to continue to be able to digest your fat soluble vitamins and a lot of these fat soluble plant compounds. You need fat to allow the gallbladder to contract and release, bile. Like you don't want to create gallstones. You want to keep your hormones optimal. But I think by and large, what a lot of people might have expected me to have done would be to cut out carbohydrates. A lot of people think that it's like cutting carbs. Carbs make you fat. But if you look at what any bodybuilder does when prepping for their shows, I mean, granted, there are probably some exceptions to this. There are exceptions to this, but like mostly they're gonna start at the very beginning, at least, cutting out the fat calories because oil is so calorie dense and fat is so calorie dense, right? You actually want to keep your carbohydrates up because the primary way to tell your body to shed the fat and to hold on to the muscle is to continue to keep your workout intensity up. And what fuels your workouts? Carbohydrates. So I learned a lot about the role of carbs and fats in this process over the past 4 months. But by and large, I saw the biggest wins with reducing my intake of fat calories. So I started eating more lean meats as opposed to the fattier cuts that I typically would have indulged in multiple times a week. Like multiple times a week, I was eating like ribeyes and things like that, which I love ribeyes. Ribeyes are great, just to be clear. And I was already at a healthy body composition. But by switching from ribeyes to leaner cuts, like strip steaks, tenderloins, sirloin steak, what have you, again, like you're cutting out a ton of fat calories, and you're still getting fat in the steak, to be clear. And I'm still getting fat elsewhere in my diet, egg yolks and the like. But you're just reducing the fat calories, optimizing for protein calories. And then I started swapping a lot of like the dairy products that I was consuming for fat-free. Now, to be clear, the research does support full-fat dairy in terms of cardiometabolic health. So when we look at the population level, it's clear based on observational data that full-fat dairy consumers seem to have better cardiometabolic health than low and reduced fat dairy. But as I've mentioned earlier, correlation doesn't equal causation. So why might this be? Well, low fat and reduced fat dairy are ultra processed, tend to be more processed, right? And so oftentimes people who consume more processed foods, well, there's what's called healthy user bias. So maybe they're consuming more, their diet is more processed in general. Maybe those low fat and fat-free dairy products are really high in added sugar, like the low fat and fat-free yogurts that, are so readily available today, and which everybody seems to think are actually good for you, right? But if you take a fat-free Greek yogurt, there's nothing that I could think of that's unhealthy about that. It's essentially like a protein supplement. I mean, it's like for 80 calories, you're getting 18 grams of protein, no fat calories, which you could put towards you could have the ribeye, because you've got to economize, right? And yeah, I found a milk product called Fairlife, which a lot of people. I have no affiliation with this company, but in an 80 calorie cup, it's like 13 grams of protein, and it tastes like whole milk. It's like amazing. And so I started to make all these little tweaks in my diet without tracking anything, without tracking calories, keeping a running tab of how much protein I'm getting over a 24-hour period. And the fat just literally started to melt off. And I was like, this is actually really easy and really fun. And holy cow, I'm at 10% body fat, which is the leanest I've ever been. And then I just kept going and I got to about 9%, which is what you see on my Instagram, which I posted on my birthday, May 29th. People can go over and check it out. But yeah, it's been a really interesting journey. And the whole time I kept my carbohydrates up. So I'm not on a zero carb. I'm not on a ketogenic diet. I kept my carbs up so that I could continue to feel energized in the gym, which is super, super important. A lot of people, this is a huge mistake that a lot of people make when trying to lose fat. They change their workouts. They think that, I'm now starting a fat loss phase. I've got to increase the amount of reps that I'm doing to tone. Huge mistake. You don't want to change your workouts at all. The same exercises and regimen that's going to optimize your muscle growth is the same that's going to help to maintain it when you're in a fat loss phase. So you want to continue to lift heavy. Don't make the assumption, like so many do, that you're just going to get weaker. I mean, actually, some probably do get weaker when they start a fat loss phase because they start cutting out the carbohydrates, right? Keep your carbohydrates as high as you can while also getting adequate fat and hitting your protein threshold, which we've discussed earlier. And you'll see that you actually don't get weaker. In the gym, you actually provided you're getting enough protein, you might actually there's even the potential that you can gain a little bit of muscle while losing fat. So I've learned a ton about this, and it's become one of my favorite topics to talk about because because I've had to check a few of my own biases, going into this process. But yeah, I'm the leanest that I've ever been in my entire life, and also I haven't lost any muscle. I'm not gaining a ton of strength in this phase, but I haven't lost any muscle. I haven't lost any strength, and I've gotten I'm the leanest I've ever been.
What initially triggered this? Was it your 41st birthday was coming up and you wanted to get in great shape for that? Kind of midlife crisis type of thing, or what was it?
Oh my God! Don't say that. Oh God! I hope I'm not in my midlife yet. I think hopefully I've got a few. Maybe I am. I don't know. No, it wasn't that. It was honestly that it was just after New Year's. Well, it was two things actually. One, I bought a bathing suit and I took a selfie of myself in the bathing suit, and I didn't think I looked I thought I looked really soft, and I was I thought to myself, I want to look more like Daniel Craig in Casino Royale. That's how I envision myself. And so I took this photo of myself in a bathing suit, and I was like, I'm a nutrition expert. I don't call myself a nutrition expert, but this is what I do professionally. I know about nutrition, right? If I can't get myself into the kind of shape that I want to be in, what hope is there for anybody else, So that was part of it. And then after the new year, I was in this place in my personal life where I was spending a lot more time kind of on my own. I'm very close to my family, but my brothers both kind of entered these serious relationships, and one of my brothers actually just had a baby. And so I was spending a lot more time eating home. And I was I'm eating home. I've got all the variables under control. Let's just and it was just after the new year, so people were back to work. It was like kind of like a back to work vibe. Like people weren't like going out as much in my social life. And so I was like, I'm eating home. I'm already like, this is already like the primary variable that makes it difficult for people to lose the weight. Like it's like that they are eating out of the house too much. Here I am, like I'm eating home. Let's see what I can do. Like if I like really roll up my sleeves and try to get like as lean as I can get, like let's see how, maybe it's going to be incredibly difficult. I don't know because I've never done this before. And I just rolled up my sleeves and I got to work and I just I hit the protein threshold that I know based on the data I need to be hitting. I didn't change my workouts at all. I increased my my walking quite a bit. So not cardio, not like running. I don't run. I'm not like I don't actually enjoy cardio. I enjoy lifting weights. But I increased my walking. Walking is like fat loss magic because it doesn't really increase your hunger all that much. And it's low intensity. So it oxidizes primarily fat, which, at the end of the day, the fat you lose or gain is determined by energy balance. But it's a fat burning exercise modality that can be easily sustained. It's easily sustainable. Almost anybody can walk, and the reward to agony ratio is just so high. With walking, like with running, yeah, there's huge reward, but the agony, like the agony quotient goes up also significantly with running. So it can be easily sustained, and it also allows you to preserve your energy. This is super important. It allows you to preserve your energy for lifting, which is, again, the signal that tells your body to hold on to the muscle and ditch instead the fat. And so walking is like I think, incredible to do for like a fat loss phase. I think so many people make the mistake of like, I'm going to lose fat, so I'm going to start running now. Just start walking. It's all you need to do. Start walking. Yeah.
I love walking, and you might find this as a podcaster too. One of the things I love about it is before a chat like this, I usually listen to whoever my guest is on a few shows and read the book. And that gives me time to be out in nature, get some sun, move my body. It's just the perfect thing to get out and consume quote unquote work at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I listen to podcasts. It makes the time go by effortlessly. It really is incredible. It's incredible. It's like you want it to be low intensity. You want it to be sustainable. You want it to not be so depleting as to take your energy, which is a finite resource, away from your strength training. And yeah, it's great. So I increased that. And then I just started adopting all these like little tweaks. I cut the fat calories primarily. And I really started to, put more emphasis on food quality and protein and yeah, it's been really great. And I feel great. Like you often hear that when people get really lean, it doesn't feel as good. It's like, they're walking around feeling depleted. I mean, I feel the best I've ever felt. And when I start to feel depleted, what's part of the plan is I do what are called refeeds, which give me like a break psychologically from, over the course of this process from the dieting phase. It's not a cheat meal. I'm not going off the rails because I don't really like over the course of this process, I haven't eliminated any foods that I love. Like I haven't restricted myself from eating foods that I love. So I don't feel like I need to like restrict and then binge or anything like that. But, I take days deliberately a couple times a week where, I increase my carbohydrates even more, which is super fun to do. Most of the indulgent foods that we enjoy, they tend to be carbohydrate rich foods. Maybe fat rich too, maybe some ice cream here and there, whatever. But like you increase back to like, to like your maintenance calorie intake. And you get this like rush of glycogen into your muscles. You look great the next day when you go to the gym. It gives you, a ton of energy. It gives you a break. Primarily, it gives you a break psychologically. It can potentially help to reverse some of the metabolic adaptation that occurs when you're dieting, when you're getting like really lean. So this is not going to be a problem. This isn't going to be an issue for most people, but when you get really lean, like when you get to like below 10% body fat, or, even above that, but if you diet too rapidly, you can, adapt. There's what's called metabolic adaptation. adaptive thermogenesis is like one of the components of this, where, you know, maybe you'll see, so actually it tends to be subconscious. You like move less, you have less energy, you know, less fidgeting, less, you know, you just have like less energy to do things. So, you know, one of these like you know, once a week or whatever, like a refeed day where you bring your carbohydrates way up back to like maintenance calories, can be really helpful to help with like, you know, diet adherence and what have you. So yeah, so I've learned to talk. This is not something that like long term I'm going to be on, but my goal is to like maintain like the new leanness that I have. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I guess the take home message would be that like it was way easier than I thought. And this is just for me. I'm not speaking for anybody else. Like I've never had, I've never been obese. I've never, you know, struggled with that. But yeah, with these tips, I think like, you know, dispelling a lot of the misinformation that's out there. Like, for example, that you need to like make your favorite foods off limits, that like, you know, you need to cut out all carbohydrates or all fat completely. I mean, those are big, I think, misconceptions, you know. I love the idea of flexible dieting, with the understanding that food quality should be like the primary variable that you modulate. But like, you know, flexible dieting, I think, is something that I've had Alan Aragon on my podcast, who's a big advocate for this. He's a big evidence-based nutrition, you know, he's like a goat in the nutrition space. You know, there's a lot of good data on this. It's not rocket science. It's like, you know, one of the things that I did, aside from look at the data, I looked at like how bodybuilders prep for shows, and success leaves clues, you know. Jesse, like, this is, again, it's not like rocket science. I think there's a lot to be learned from the way that these like professional physique competitors get into like the amazing shape that they get into for their competitions.
Which is a perfect segue where I want to go with this. The fact that you are somebody, and it becomes really obvious as you share this part of your journey, the fact that working out and resistance training is a big part of this transformation. And why I want to bring this up is a lot of people aren't going to prioritize their time or have the time to work out like that. And if they start, you know, keeping their carbohydrates the same and they're trying to lose weight or even bringing those up a bit, that could be a problem if they're not using their body and moving their body. So what I'm getting at here is, how big of a piece do you consider the resistance training as part of this transformation?
Oh my God, resistance training is like, it's so important. I mean, resistance training is like, now I'm biased. Everybody has their own, you know, favorite workout modality. Mine is definitely going to be resistance training. Like, I've just loved it for as long as I've been an adult. But no, it is really important because it provides the stimulus for your body to both grow and maintain its muscle mass. Muscle is, you know, metabolically incredibly expensive. I mean, it burns calories just sitting on your frame. So, you know, when you enter a calorie deficit, which is, you know, first law of thermodynamics, like if you want to lose fat, you have to, I mean, that's going to be part of what needs to be achieved, you know, is a calorie deficit. Your body's going to want to like shed what it can to ensure that you don't starve to death, right? Like, your brain is a massively hungry energy consumer, accounting for 25% of your basal metabolic rate. And, you know, obviously other tissues like are massive energy consumers as well. But like muscle is like, provided you have enough muscle to like get up and move about the world, like it's pretty expendable, because you could always grow new muscle later, you know. We have what are called satellite cells. Everybody, you know, people are probably familiar with the concept of muscle memory. But in a fat loss phase, unless you're resistance training, you're going to shed muscle. You know, and what you don't want after a cutting phase is to just look like a smaller version of yourself. You don't want that. You want to look like, I mean, I'm assuming that anybody who wants to do this wants to come out on the other end looking shredded, right? Like, and so you want to continue to lift weights to maintain that muscle, which your body will do, provided you're providing it the appropriate stimulus. And again, yeah, you want to continue lifting with intensity. So like, you know, continuing to lift the heavy weights and focusing on the big compound movements, crucially important.
And by the sounds of it, you're in the middle of this quote unquote experiment. I think you mentioned you're around 9% body fat. I'm not sure how much longer you plan on doing it. It sounds like it is an experiment, and I'm sure there's certain things you'll take and apply for years to come. What I'm getting at here is, do you fear that body fat percentage is going to continue to come down and come down to a point where you're going to have to start seeing that as a negative?
My goal is to maintain what I've achieved. I'm not really trying to get to like competition level leanness or anything like that. But it's really to maintain, because I've learned, as you've alluded to, I've learned a lot, and yeah, I've learned things that I'm going to take with me like now for the rest of my life, And I think one of the greatest benefits of this process isn't even necessarily that I've gotten to this, quote unquote low body fat percentage. And there are people that get way more shredded and are way bigger, so I'm not like some, but my goal is really to show people that it's possible. Like, I don't have like incredible genetics. I'm not even particularly strong. Like, I just, it was all through dedication and discipline and having patience and perseverance. But I've learned a lot, and I now have, most importantly, the skill. Like, I've attained the skill of knowing how to modulate my body fat in this way. Like, some days I'll want to have like the ribeye, maybe multiple days, like I'll probably, if I go on vacation, I'm not going to worry about it because I know that like all the carbohydrates that I'll be eating on vacation are going into to fuel my workouts. I think in the past, my focus was primarily on the preservation of cognitive health, the optimization of cognitive health and metabolic health. And that's, and also when looking at population statistics, when you see, data that suggests that we are by and large a metabolically ill society, I think like the low-hanging fruit for most people is going to be, again, focusing on food quality and all the things that I've said throughout the years, like bringing, like getting rid of the food fear and bringing back to the table some of these foods that we've been told for decades should be off limits, right? Like eggs, red meat, things like that. So dispelling a lot of those myths. But yeah, I mean, I guess there was like a part of myself that was always curious about like, the more body composition side of things, the more performance aspect, the performance related side of things. And so, yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think like, yeah, I wouldn't want to get too lean because, first of all, getting very lean is not, there are sacrifices that need to be made. And that influencer that you see flashing their six pack on social media, like, you have no idea the level of obsession that they embody. And to live a full life, like, there's obviously more to life than being super lean. And I have had to make sacrifices over the past couple of months to get to even 9% body fat. I've had to turn down like going out to eat as much as I was doing in the past. I've had to prioritize like cooking at home. Like even going out to lunch is something that like I was doing almost every weekday previously, and now I prioritize. For the past 4 months, I prioritize like eating home more. So I'm spending a lot more time like in my house, and those are non-trivial sacrifices. And so I don't plan on keeping that aspect of things up forever. But nonetheless, I think the value of like having attained this skill of knowing how to when I want to modulate my body fat to this level of specificity or whatever, I think has been incredibly valuable. So yeah, so hopefully, or not hopefully, I know that I will like, at some point, probably even at this phase, because I've already kind of like surpassed the goal that I've initially set for myself, regain a little bit more like balance. But all that is to say, like the overarching feeling that I've had about this journey has been like it's been a really fun and fascinating one.
Oh, this is definitely fascinating. And I would assume it would be the same for you. A lot of the guests that come on the show, when it comes to weight loss, the two areas of attack are intermittent fasting, so narrowing that eating window, and then cutting down on carbs, which you've mentioned the carb factor. That's not something you've toned down at all. If anything, you've increased them. And then you didn't even mention intermittent fasting. Earlier, you talked about having a high protein breakfast. So no, this is good. We need different opinions, and you have a picture to prove it too. And we can see you here, whoever's watching, like you're living this and it's working for you. And where my curiosity is piqued, and I'm sure a lot of the people that are listening and watching, is the fact that this is so 180 of what I just mentioned there. And we know that is working for people. We know, you've had Dr. Jason Fung on your show, and I've had a number of guests talk about intermittent fasting and narrowing that eating window and keeping insulin down, keeping blood glucose down to melt the fat away. And you're showing it can happen in this totally different paradigm. So talk about how you feel about the paradigm I talked about. Was that kind of how you thought about it before? And then how do you think about that now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm super happy that we have people talking about intermittent fasting with relation to weight loss, because, you've got to find the form of restriction that's going to feel the least restrictive to you. And so for some people, intermittent fasting is going to be the thing that works. And it's a tool like any other tool. And if it works for you, then that's amazing. I also think that intermittent fasting, specifically time-restricted eating, there's a lot of good data about the value of not eating too late at night from the standpoint of metabolic homeostasis. So I generally try not to eat too close to bedtime. Like that's a 2 or 3 hours before bed is generally when I'm trying to cut off my food consumption. But that's when it comes to body composition, it doesn't make such a huge deal. I will say that eating too late at night can dysregulate some of the hormones that are involved in hunger. So you don't want to be hungry when you're trying to lose fat. And so intermittent fasting can potentially play a role with regard to helping maintain and optimize your hunger levels. But at the end of the day, what you eat still matters more than when you eat. But when you eat is still a variable that matters, and not primarily with regard to body composition, but for other factors that are also important, like metabolic health, blood pressure, blood glucose. I don't know if you've spoken to Sachin Panda, but I mean, we can't discount the research on circadian biology that he's doing and that he's presented. So there's that. But it's just it's a tool, and if it works for you, then great. But also. We have to, I think, be mindful of the fact that what most people are eating after dinner, those calories are not coming typically from a good place. Like most people, once they've eaten dinner and they're settling around the couch to binge watch their favorite, the latest Succession, whatever the latest greatest streaming show is, whatever, those calories tend not to come from high protein, healthful food. They tend to come from junk food, whether it's ice cream or, and these foods are enjoyable foods, certainly, but they tend to be from hyperpalatable, ultra processed foods. So that's a parameter that can work for many people, to consider the kitchen closed after dinner has been consumed. So I'm not I'm not discrediting intermittent fasting or anything like that. It's just that, if it's a tool that works for you, then great. But you don't necessarily need to do it. Although it seems to be time restricted eating specifically seems to play a role with regard to metabolic homeostasis and helping to optimize various hormones involved in hunger and satiety and the like. For example, sleep doesn't necessarily sleep doesn't you wouldn't assume that sleep would play a role in fat loss, right? But sleep is an activity that optimizes your hunger hormones, right? And your ability to emotionally regulate. So if you don't sleep well, if you deprive yourself of adequate sleep, meta-analyses show that a person tends to consume more calories the following day by about 400 to 500 additional calories the following day, and mostly from junk food, right? So it's there are these other variables that can play a role in our subjective sense of hunger and satiety. And so on any weight loss like plan, yeah, these factors all play a role. Um, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it does ultimately come down to calories in, calories out. The problem, I think, happens when you lead with that, because that doesn't provide the practical information that's going to lead most people to make sustainable behavioral changes in their life. So while energy balance does matter, the problem, I think, comes from like when fitness influencers make it all about calories, right? And they neglect to mention the fact that if you just are moderating the calories from the obesogenic food that you've been consuming your whole life to get you to this obese state, then you're setting yourself up for failure. So again, they matter, but like without talking about the fact that food quality largely dictates the quantity of food that we subsequently eat, without talking about the fact that sleep is so crucially important for helping to optimize our hunger hormones, without talking about the fact that like eating too late at night might also play a role in dysregulating hunger hormones, without being present with your food, we tend to consume about 15% more calories. There's all these other factors, and then the whole protein piece, which of course we've already talked about. I think it's my view is that it's better to lead with those more practical tools like the intermittent fasting, like the food quality bit, because it actually gives people like tactical and practical modifications that they can then start to like engage with and iterate with and experiment with in their own lives. By just focusing on the calories, I think that's a huge mistake. And that's also ultimately the mantra of like the junk food industry, right? Like it's not like our problem that you're overweight. It's the fact that you just weren't able to moderate your consumption of our ice cream or of our high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverages. It's like it's like your fault, But like those foods are not designed to be consumed in moderation. They perpetuate their own overconsumption, right? With like good intentions, like the food manufacturers want to create repeat customers. So yeah, I just think it's like where people tend to put the focus. Like, my view is like I think that the focus needs to be placed on these more helpful and tactile behavioral, modifications. And so I guess that's where like, that's where I think like there should be a seat at the table for intermittent fasting, for all these other like things that people are talking about. It's just like, I think the problems can arise when influencers or even quote unquote diet experts online tend to make the focus like too much about these things and try to make it sound like this is the only way to achieve whatever goal it is that you aspire to achieve. Like intermittent fasting is the only way to lose weight. That's not true. Like, when calories are controlled, there's really no intermittent fasting works, but there's no benefit of intermittent fasting over, a more calorie centric approach. The problem is like a lot of these studies are short term, and you might be able to moderate your consumption of junk food calories for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe even 4 months. But over the long term, unless you have a more practical strategy in place, you're essentially setting yourself up for failure.
One of the other paradigm shifts that you're bringing up a lot throughout our conversation is this calorie piece. And a lot of the influencers these days are saying calories don't matter, don't worry about calories. I know you're not all about calories. I think you're somewhere in between like I am, where they do matter to a point and they do have some validity. But I want to make sure before we part ways, you have a chance to fully hash out how you feel about calories, because when you start talking about cutting out calories, my brain goes to the body going into a famine state and starting to drop the basal metabolic rate and people having problems when they try to make that shift. How do you feel about that? And then get into the nuance of calories and how you see it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you do need to, like, all of these different diets work. And the mechanism by which they work is they put the person who's the practitioner into a calorie deficit. Right? So some diets will just exclude ultra-processed foods. Some diets will exclude all carbohydrates. Some diets, and they all have different benefits, but ultimately it's about the person has to figure out what diet is going to be most sustainable for them. That's why all diets fail. It's not that diets don't work. It's just that people don't adhere to diets because they adopt this very black and white thinking, like dichotomous mentality about these diets. Because you have a lot of people, on social media primarily that are like, well, unless you're adhering to the most pristine version of this diet, you're not doing it right. So you got to find the form of restriction, as I've mentioned, that works best for you. Maybe it's intermittent fasting. Maybe it's ketogenic dieting. Maybe it's low carb dieting. All good. Like they're all good. And there are some advantages, like I think a low carb diet is, probably be more sustainable for most than like a low fat diet, but maybe not. I don't know. I mean, everybody's different. When it comes to calories, the more overweight you are, the greater of a calorie deficit you can, basically the less you can eat. And the more rapid your weight loss can be, without experiencing, a lot of the sort of essentially the side effects that one might experience in a leaner state, because you've got more fat to lose. So there's just more energy available in the body for building and maintaining muscle, and going about your daily activities and the like. The leaner you get, it becomes, you have to cut out, it becomes more difficult. It's a lot easier to go from 16% body fat to 12% body fat than it is to go from 10% body fat to 8% body fat. It becomes a lot more difficult. And so, part of what happens is metabolic adaptation, which includes this like reduction in NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which you're not even conscious of this, but you'll notice, maybe you're fidgeting less. Your body just burns fewer calories. It's not that you've damaged your metabolism or anything like that, but you can generally bring it up by integrating a few refeed days here and there. But no, I mean, calories, like they're they matter. Like they're, what can I say? But it's important to know where your calories are coming from because that matters as well. Like protein calories are your body doesn't store protein as fat. You're made of fat. I mean, it can, but it's very difficult for your body to do. And your body, it wouldn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint for your body to prioritize storing protein as fat. Fat, on the other hand, is very easily stored as fat, and so is carbohydrates once you've overconsumed them and triggered de novo lipogenesis. Like your body can create fat from carbohydrates. And so that's why at the end of the day, like, the data shows that the ratio of carbohydrates to fat in your diet doesn't so much matter when protein is controlled. When protein is controlled, when you're getting adequate protein, it really is up to you to determine what mixture of carbohydrates and fat is going to be the most enjoyable to you to sustain that calorie deficit so that you can continue to lose weight on a consistent basis. And so that's why I think it's like it's problematic that you see so many people that are like in the diet wars, like low carb is better, low fat is better. People might lose weight quicker on a low carb diet at the onset, but that's primarily water weight that they're losing. At the end of the day, it really doesn't. There's no strong evidence that suggests that one is any better than the other. It just ultimately comes down to like what's going to be the most sustainable for you.
Have you experimented with going the other way and cutting out carbs totally and doing a carnivore diet? Because this is something in the weight loss realm, in the health world in general, it seems to be taking things by storm. Have you played with it, and how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I've done keto in the past, and keto, you can lose fat on a ketogenic diet as well. But I had a bit of a revelation when, over the course of the pandemic, I took up boxing. And I would often, I used to do like a lot of my workouts fasted. And so I started boxing fasted. And one day there was like a shift in my schedule and I wasn't able to go fasted. So I actually ate something, and I ate something I think pretty carbohydrate heavy prior to my session. And I had way more energy. And I subsequently noticed that when I had when I was like replete with glycogen before my boxing workouts, I had tons more energy, and it was like, I wouldn't bonk as quickly because boxing is a very intense workout. I mean, I was like one-on-one trainer with like a professional boxer. And that was kind of like a light bulb moment for me where I really, in that context, realized the value that carbohydrates can potentially play in exercise performance. And like, you hear stories all the time of professional athletes like, experimenting with low carb ketogenic diets. But by and large, most professional athletes, and again, ultimately like bodybuilders and the like, they're utilizing carbohydrates as a performance enhancing tool. And I've always talked about carbohydrates as a performance enhancing tool. That's really their best, aside from the value of fiber, which, is like a whole different rabbit hole to go down. Carbohydrates should be utilized for their ability to enhance physical performance. And so that was kind of like a light bulb moment for me where I started, consuming carbs pre-workout. And, my resistance training workouts were, have always been really good. But yeah, I started to notice like a greater sense of energy. Not that I felt like some sort of caffeinated. I think that's like a misconception that a lot of people have, that carbohydrates are going to like jack you up like caffeine. That's not how it works. It's just you're able to pump out like 1 or 2 more reps when you've had like, carbohydrates in your system with like a given exercise, because you've got more like glycogen stored in your muscles. And so I think like, look, there are people on social media that get, in fantastic shape with low carb diets and the like. So, I don't want to, trash talk low carb diets. And also for people with like, going back to the brain health piece, like if I had a neurological condition, I would absolutely be experimenting with ketogenic dieting. I've always said that. The research is just like, it's too important to overlook. But with regard to like, physical performance, body composition, I think it's worth a try, especially for people who've been told that to lose fat, you got to cut out all the carbohydrates. I just think it's like important to like kind of dispel that myth. I don't even want to say it's misinformation, because people tend to experience success with a diet and they want to proselytize, the diet that's worked for them. And I don't hold that against anybody, but yeah, it's, if you can, I think the more access points that people have to sustainable, flexible dieting, the better. And so this is just sort of my N of 1 experience. And I hope it, provided value.
Have you ever, say for 30 days a week, totally cut out carbs though and just had meat? Went full carnivore?
Full carnivore? No, I've never done that.
Just to see how you feel and see what your performance is like.
Yeah, I've never done that. I don't think I like to have more diversity in my diet. And I like vegetables. I like salads. I like, my hypothesis is that a lot of these carnivore dieters just don't like vegetables. They don't like the way they taste. Obviously there are some people who do better symptomatically with various like autoimmune conditions when they cut out some of these plant compounds. I'm not denying that, but I love dietary diversity, and I think it's important to integrate. We're seeing now compounds like dietary flavonols. There's new evidence to suggest that they can help slow cognitive aging, which are essentially plant defense compounds. We know the value that plant pigments like carotenoids play in eye and brain health. So I do think that there are many valuable compounds offered to us by plants. That being said, I do probably owe it to myself to experiment with a carnivore diet the same way that I've experimented with this. I am, at the end of the day, somebody who enjoys experimenting with different dietary paradigms, but I don't think that these dietary extremes are the way. I really don't. I think that a carnivore diet's a great elimination diet for somebody who's experiencing mysterious symptoms and wants to potentially do the most extreme form of an elimination diet there is. But I don't think it's like a long-term solution. There's not a lot of good data on it, and again, I think there's a lot of good to be gained from plants. So yeah, maybe someday, but I haven't as of yet, Jesse.
All right, we're going to end on this. Hypothetical situation, somebody can't exercise. So maybe they're extremely overweight. They're 300, 350 pounds. They just can't work out at this point. They want to lose weight. Or their schedule is just so demanding that they realistically can't work out on a regular basis. In that case, could you see value in cutting out carbs all the way to a carnivore diet, or just taking them down to, say, 50 grams of carbs a day? given that they're not going to be moving their body a whole lot?
Yeah, I mean, I think for people with like metabolic dysfunction, cutting the carbohydrates is a good strategy. At the very least, there seems to be you'd probably get away with less medication, from a glucose regulation standpoint, with a reduction in glycemic load. I didn't start from a place of metabolic dysfunction, so that's why I didn't. I feel my body knows how to process carbohydrates. I'm also very active. For somebody who's not super active, yeah, I think that would probably be my my strategy, like to take a more low carbohydrate approach. For one, because you're not really, as in this hypothetical, you have no need for those dietary carbohydrates, right? So I would do a low carb diet. The one caveat that I would add is I would prioritize non-starchy vegetables. So like vegetables that are rich in fiber, which is also satiating. And I would also make sure that the fats that I'm ingesting were primarily, healthful monounsaturated fats, like from olive oil, avocado oil. And I would still be opting for the lean meats. I wouldn't be going overboard with the saturated fat and the like. I would still be doing, because like in an obese person, you probably already have some degree of lipid dysregulation, right? Maybe, possibly not, but like in all likelihood, there's probably already some degree of lipid dysregulation. I would, healthy fats, dietary fiber, lots of protein, and yeah, I think a low carb strategy in that situation would be, totally reasonable.
All right, Max, really enjoyed the conversation. Always do. Thank you for coming back on the show. We're going to link up your social media, your website, your books, everything on the website, and look forward to doing this again down the line. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. You're the man.
Now that you're done with my conversation with Max, you're going to want to head over here and catch our previous chat. We go deep into his top longevity foods. I'll see you over there.
People who consume between 1 and 2 cups of dark leafy greens every day have brains that perform up to 11 years younger. I like to say that